Video games can live or die by the strength of their marketing, and generally speaking, the more money is put into advertising, the more hype that surrounds the release of a new title. However, once hype has built up too much, it's almost inevitable that the game associated with it will just not be able to live up to the players' expectations, leaving many to feel extremely let down by the product they finally do receive, especially as games become increasingly costly. Even though a game that's disappointing will sometimes end up being bad, that's not always the case. Rather, it simply doesn't live up to that pre-release promise, and the majority of players who give it a go at launch find that the experience they end up with is seriously lacking. So today, we're taking a look at just a few of the titles that have released in states that were not up to fans' expectations. I'm Ben from TripleJump, and here are 10 of the most disappointing video games of all time. Number 10. Marvel's Avengers. Video games that have ties to existing franchises have had a bumpy ride over the years, and for every Guardians of the Galaxy, there's a Superman 64 waiting just around the corner. One of these titles that's closer to the latter than it is the former is the relatively recent Marvel's Avengers. Thanks to the success of the nearly 2-decade-long cinematic universe, players were initially excited at the prospect of playing as their favorite hero, with many hoping and expecting something that would be on par with the wonderful Spider-Man from a couple of years prior. Upon release, however, the game showed its true colors. Though it boasts a decent single-player campaign, at least initially, following Kamala Khan as she investigates the attack at the Avengers Day event and takes up the mantle of Miss Marvel, everything else on offer after that's finished boils down to a grindy, repetitive slog riddled with loot boxes and microtransactions. It's not just the Avengers who've fallen victim to this treatment, as live service games have become more and more common in recent years, but most others don't generate the level of hype that came along with the superheroes, meaning that Marvel's offering became even more of a disappointment than the rest. Number 9. Spore. The Sims was released in 2000 and became an instant sensation, sweeping players up in its strangely compelling mundane life simulation. Paying bills and working may be a pain in real life, but watching blocky humanoids do it, especially when you can put them in a pool with no ladder if they misbehave, so much fun. As a result, when series creator Will Wright and the team of folks at Maxis announced Spore, which seemed to massively build upon everything they had previously made, plenty of people couldn't wait to sink their teeth into it. Supposedly, players would be able to start as a single-celled organism and evolve all the way up to a spacefaring species in a huge sandbox universe simulator. In truth, though, the devs were promising too much, and when the game was released, players found that the gameplay was tedious and many of the promised features were missing. On top of that, there was a whole lot of controversy surrounding the game's use of DRM and what it could do, which also left a bad taste in people's mouths. Spore was still a bit of fun, though, if only because of the ridiculous and suggestive creatures that could be made, but it was a lot more of a chore than people anticipated. Number 8. Daikatana. One of the most popular developers of the 90s, John Romero, was behind the biggest FPS games of the era and is perhaps most famous for being one of the designers behind the original Doom. As a result, the first game he planned on making after leaving id Software, Daikatana, was met with excitement when it was first announced in 1997. The marketing promised, well, it certainly promised something, and strangely enough, folks weren't especially on board with that declaration, but expectations were still high, as most believed that, with Romero's pedigree, the game would be just as industry-changing. All was not well behind the scenes, though, as Daikatana went through a turbulent development process, including a change of game engine, staff members leaving mid-project, and numerous delays that meant the game wasn't released until the summer of 2000. When it finally arrived, the game was already outdated thanks to the aforementioned delays, and the multitude of glitches and the insultingly bad AI did little to endear it to players either. It was also compared unfavorably to the likes of Half-Life, which was far superior both visually and performance-wise despite being released 2 years prior. See, John? This is what you get for being a potty mouth. Number 7. Watch Dogs. Gamers have a tendency to get lured in by pretty graphics and effects, and things were no different when Ubisoft's Watch Dogs was first shown off in its original E3 gameplay demo. With its impressive graphical fidelity and moody atmosphere, it was set to be one of the best-looking games of the generation, and people were understandably excited. Unfortunately, the final product that was delivered 2 years later didn't meet the expectations that the demo had set. The graphics, while not terrible, were nothing like what had been promised, and what made it sting even more was that Ubisoft refused to acknowledge it, claiming that they hadn't been changed in any way, despite side-by-side comparison making it easily noticeable. More tellingly, modders discovered that the advanced graphics were actually still hidden in the files, at least for the PC version, and simply hadn't been activated. This wasn't all though, as it turned out that the story and protagonist, Aiden Pierce, were both serviceable but dull, and the dialogue wasn't the best either. In addition, for a game that relied upon hacking, the act of doing so turned out to be fairly repetitive and boring. The Watch Dogs series continues to set expectations high and not quite be able to deliver on them, and it seems like it's only a matter of time before it happens again. Number 6. Red Steel. When the Wii first released, it was a sensation, promising broad family appeal and a revolution in gaming with its motion controls, which led to the humble console being quite hard to come by in some markets. One of the promised launch games was Red Steel, a departure from the company's usual family-friendly fare that was meant to appeal to teens and older gamers while also showing off the capabilities and possibilities of the motion controls, which would allow for precise gunplay and immersive sword fighting. This, combined with the intense marketing, set the game up to be something mind-blowing. As with many other motion-based affairs, however, this was very much not how things played out, with many finding the controls to be glitchy, clunky, and imprecise. The graphics weren't anything special either, and weren't even on par with other Wii launch titles. Despite this, the game performed well enough to get a standalone sequel, which mostly made up for the first game's shortcomings and was much better received. It's possible that if the series were picked up again today, it could become the phenomenon it was originally supposed to be, but with no news on the franchise for well over a decade, it seems unlikely. Number 5. The Order 1886. PS4 exclusive title The Order 1886 has an incredible setup, a secret society known as the Order of the Knights who fight to keep the people of alternate history London safe from the threat of monsters and rebel groups, with the whole thing topped off by a strong steampunk aesthetic and filled with Tesla coils and political intrigue. This far into the list, though, it should come as no surprise that the game doesn't actually deliver on its promise, as the story is short and forgettable and there's next to no replay value. Much of the actual gameplay just sees players walk from one cover-based shooting section to another, and the fights against larger enemies are mostly QTE-based. Also, a large chunk of the narrative is taken up by cutscenes, with many noting that at times it felt more like it was trying to be a film than a game, and that its impressive presentation was about all it had going for it. In the end, The Order 1886 was let down by its sheer insistence that it be turned into a franchise, along with its focus on being cinematic rather than fun to play, meaning that it just couldn't keep players' interest. By the time they got to the cliffhanger at the very end, most couldn't be fussed to care about it. Number 4. No Man's Sky. One of the most infamous cases of promising too much and delivering too little, No Man's Sky aimed to give players the run of a full-size procedurally generated universe with a huge range of biodiversity and a full 18 quintillion different planets. That's an 18 followed by 18 zeros, by the way. Suffice it to say that No Man's Sky shot for the moon and ended up somewhere around Pluto. When the game launched in 2018, many found it to be severely lacking in comparison to what had been promised, with the gameplay very quickly becoming repetitive and monotonous and the survival elements that had been implemented being lackluster. In addition, it was clear that though it could create an unthinkable number of unique planets, it didn't mean those worlds would have anything interesting to do on them. It didn't help things that the media caught wind of the ambitious project, landing No Man's Sky and especially Hello Games co-founder Sean Murray squarely in the public eye. Even though it has been massively improved in the years since its release, with the developers working tirelessly in order to implement features that players assumed would be there at launch and adding things to do, the initial product has made many gamers wary of devs that promise the moon on a stick. Number 3. Mass Effect 3. I'm sure anyone familiar with the Mass Effect series was expecting it to show up on this list, but most likely thought we'd go with Mass Effect Andromeda. In our mind though, Mass Effect 3 is the bigger disappointment, and even though it's decent overall, that ending was a complete letdown. The third installment of the action RPG joins Commander Shepard and their crew as they recruit support for the Alliance, who have found the schematics for a giant space weapon, the Crucible, which can rid the universe of the Reaper threat. The gameplay, like that of the previous titles, features loads of combat encounters, Paragon or Renegade dialogue options, and space romance, with the only major addition being war assets and the Galaxy at War multiplayer mode, which both help influence the ending. At the climax of the game, players are finally confronted with the fate of the universe, and the exciting conclusion lets them choose one of 3 endings: destroy, control, or synthesis. Reducing the end of a tens of hours long RPG down to multiple choice is bad enough, but the worst part of all is that the best endings are blocked unless the player has built up enough military strength. There's little wonder so many were furious when they finally reached the end of this epic space opera. Number 2. Mighty Number 9. After the 10th entry in the main series released in 2010, Mega Man disappeared from the public eye for a while, only showing up in crossovers and collections, so fans of the franchise were thrilled when series veteran Keiji Inafune announced in 2013 that Mighty Number 9 would be releasing as a spiritual successor, and within 2 days the Kickstarter had already reached its goal. Unfortunately, things started to take a turn even before release, with many delays and poor communication causing those who backed the project to start worrying. Once the game did release in 2016, it was clear that these concerns were justified, as the full version of Mighty No. 9 suffered from a plethora of bugs and glitches and had issues with lag and stuttering across all platforms, with the Wii U version suffering the most. In addition, the enemies were repetitive, and overall the game was lacking in the charm that the original Mega Man titles had. After this less than ideal launch, both the 3DS and Vita ports were scrapped, as it was clear that fans' faith in the project was long gone. Thanks to the excitement for this title, Mega Man did eventually resurface properly in 2018, but the fact that it took this slap in the fanbase's collective face to revitalize the franchise almost doesn't make it worth it. Number 1. Aliens Colonial Marines. Aliens Colonial Marines, the game that single-handedly destroyed the reputation of its associated franchise. Ever since its debut, Ridley Scott's horror masterpiece Alien has been considered a classic of the genre, so when Colonial Marines was initially announced, fans couldn't wait to get their hands on it. The 2012 E3 demo also looked incredibly impressive, which only added to the excitement. Unfortunately, the game suffered during development, as it was reportedly in production for 6 years, passed around from developer to developer, and ultimately outsourced, which caused it to be rushed for release. Upon launch, the visuals were nowhere near what had been shown off, with low-res textures and uninspired, confusing level design, along with a number of glitches and notoriously bad AI that saw the intimidating acid-filled xenomorphs walk around like lost puppies. The worst part of all of this is the game could have been improved at least a bit if only it hadn't been for a spelling error in the code, which turned out to be the main reason the xenomorph AI was so terrible. Thankfully, the Alien universe was able to recover somewhat with the fantastic Alien Isolation, but thanks to the damage done by Colonial Marines, it's still going to be a tough sell in future for anything Alien related.